Hello, my wonderful friends. Welcome to me and my tiny microphone. Welcome to my very first podcast after rebranding to Soulshine Wisdom from This is Bliss. Welcome to Soulshine Wisdom, a podcast where we spark creativity, inspire intuitive living, and honor our inner child. My name's Bliss. I'm your host, and I have a background in psychology and mental health and a heart rooted in spirituality. We're here to explore self-expression, intuition, and inner child healing so that you can let your radiant soul shine. We're going to talk about reading the tarot and how to learn how to read tarot cards. So if you've ever been curious about how to read tarot or just want the down low secret sauce to getting started on your tarot journey, tune in. So let's get started. So I have been reading tarot since about 2020. I mostly read for myself, but I have from time to time read for other people and read by donation. I don't consider myself an expert tarot reader, but I did get some pretty good footing from some video I watched from Gem Goddess back in the day, where she talked about how to read tarot, and showing up consistently for a tarot practice has really helped me to hone my skills. I will say I am the type of person that still looks up the definition, the meaning of the cards from time to time, but for the most part I have a pretty good idea when I pull a card what it means. So I want to share with you what I learned from Gem Goddess, what I learned from my 5+ years reading tarot myself, and the secret shortcuts that really helped me to understand the cards and the meaning of the cards in a pretty simple and straightforward way. So first off, let's dispel a common myth when it comes to the tarot. And this is so common, you probably have heard of it, that if you are wanting to start reading tarot or you're wanting to get your own tarot deck, that it must be gifted to you. This is BS. If you want to wait until someone gifts it for you or have someone buy you your first deck, feel free, but there is no bad luck, jinx, hex, or curse that comes with buying your own very first own tarot deck. So I do have some recommendations for when you're shopping for a tarot deck, because I know there are tons of decks out there and there are thousands probably of beautiful decks with original imagery, so it might be hard to choose right off the bat your very first favorite deck. I do recommend for your first deck to get the Rider-Waite deck and to get pretty well acquainted with that one. It's the original deck and it has the original imagery and the original symbolism, so that will be the most basic and straightforward interpretation for each card, because the other decks, the special custom decks that people make, while I love them and I own a couple of them myself, a lot of times the imagery is a little bit different. So get something Rider-Waite or Rider-Waite inspired. Get well acquainted with that. You can always get a second deck at some point, which I recommend. And I will say that different decks have different energies. And so the symbolism for, let's say the star card on the Rider-Waite deck might have slightly different symbolism and meaning than the star card on the Rainbow Heart Tarot deck. So that's something to keep in mind. So the cards are split into two categories: the major and minor arcana. The major arcana are the cards like the Fool, the Star, Strength, the Sun, the World, Death, the Devil, Judgment, etc. And then the minor arcana consist of cards 1 through 10, and then court cards, so the Page, the Knight, the Queen, and the King, in the suits of Swords, Wands, Cups, and Pentacles. And the major arcana are generally the ones that correspond with bigger life events or bigger themes, while the minor arcana are more day-to-day themes and a little bit simpler meanings than the big themes of the major arcana. I will say, if you have a reading and there are many major arcana cards within that reading, then that means that there are some big messages that are coming through for you. So I mentioned briefly that there are 4 suits in the minor arcana. And each of those suits corresponds with an element, and the elements themselves correspond with different energies. If you're into anything witchy or woo-woo, you might be familiar with these elements and what these elements correspond with. Again, we have the swords, the pentacles, the wands, and cups. And their correspondences are pretty clear cut when you just think about it, so it's easy to remember. So swords, like let's say you're waving a sword through the air, correspond with the element of air. Pentacles, which represent like material or like material wealth, corresponds with earth. The wands, like a magic wand you would wave around and then zap someone with, corresponds with the element of fire. And then cups correspond with water, like you would find in a cup. So let's briefly touch on the different elements and the suits that correspond with them and what the elements mean. So air, or swords, corresponds with things like ideas, intellect, communication. Think of speaking into the air. Sometimes it has to do with creativity, but that can also be the fire with the wands. It has to do with technology. Think of like Mercury in retrograde. Anything that goes wonky during Mercury in retrograde generally has correspondences with the air symbolism, which corresponds with swords, because Mercury is the planet of communication. So Pentacles represents earth. It can represent prosperity or abundance, material wealth, material gain, physical things that are made manifest. It can also represent like a grounding energy. And then Wands corresponds with fire, as I mentioned previously, corresponds with creativity, passion, taking inspired action. It's a fast moving element. And then Cups corresponds with water, which represents emotion, intuition, feelings, love to some extent, and relationships with others. And so once you kind of get an idea of the four suits and the elements that they correspond with, and then the corresponding symbolism of each element, you can move on to interpreting cards by adding the numerological meaning of the number of the card to that element. You're also going to want to obviously look at the symbolism and the imagery on the card. But let's talk a little bit about numerology for those of you who are unaware. So numerology talks about numbers and their spiritual meanings. So 1 is usually for beginnings. That would be the ace card. So the ace of wands, the ace of cups, the ace of swords, and the ace of pentacles. So that usually indicates something beginning. 2s often represent duality. They can also represent one-on-one relationships, such as the Two of Cups, or balance, such as the Two of Pentacles. 3 often represents creativity, harmony. 4 represents stability and security. It can also have a little bit of a stuck, stagnant type energy. Think of like 4 legs of a table, 4 legs of a chair, 4 walls of a house. And all of these, obviously with the number 4, a table will be secure and steady on four legs. But if you're in 4 walls, it can also feel like a little bit of a trapped energy, depending on the suit and depending on the imagery of the card. 5 represents change. It also often represents conflict. 6 represents balance and harmony. I know with the 6 of Cups, I believe it has to do with nostalgia. 6 can also be indulgence, whether that's overindulgence or the opposite of that, which would be scarcity. 7, spirituality and luck. 8, abundance, prosperity, financial fulfillment. 9, endings, things that are coming to an end. 10, completion, whole, things that are coming full circle. And then let's talk about the court cards. So the court cards are something that I still get hung up on a lot of times, but generally they all have the same meaning throughout the suits. And oftentimes when you pull a court card, it can represent a person, in your reading, but it also can represent an energy or just a message, especially with the Knight cards. Those are often messenger cards, so they usually have a message. So the page, think of the page as the beginner, the student, someone who is on a new journey, learning something new. The Knights are messengers. They take action, they're explorers. Oftentimes they have an impulsive energy to them. The Queens represent feminine energy. A lot of times it's more of like an inflow type energy, receptive energy, and a little bit more of detail oriented, as opposed to the King, who is a masculine energy, which would be more of less receptive and more like productive, ruling, bigger picture type of view. And then you have the visual symbolism of each card, which is unique to each card, and it's unique between decks. But oftentimes when you look at the colors can have different meanings. We can go all into colors another day, but let's say like a lot of times when you think of the colors, if you know the chakras, that can be really helpful. So blue has to do with communication, so it's like a throat chakra. Red is more of a grounding energy, but it can also be a very passionate energy or represent love. It can also represent anger, so it's all in context. Purple is often a royal type energy. It has to do with the crown chakra. So a lot of times it's spiritual. I believe the High Priestess card has a lot of purple in it, if I'm not mistaken. But in addition to the colors, looking at the images and illustrations on each card really tells its own story. And once you get a little bit more familiar, like let's say you start pulling cards on the daily, looking up the definitions, I implore you to try and come up with the definitions of the card, the meaning of the card, you're on your own by looking at it and referencing the numerology and the suits, etc. But once you start getting used to pulling cards and getting used to like pulling some of the same cards, the card imagery really is just a quick reference for you to pull up all the symbolism and all the meaning behind the card just at a glance once you get used to them. And that leads me into learning through practice. This is something that I'm sure there are like mini tarot books, and you can probably read a tarot book and it would be very helpful, but you're not going to read a tarot book and then just be an expert on tarot. It's something that takes practice and time and commitment, but it is a fun journey to learn the tarot. As long as you don't take it too seriously, it can be really fun. So I recommend pulling a daily card. You can do this with a tarot deck, but if you don't have a tarot deck, you can also use an app. There's an app called Mystic Mondays that you can pull a virtual card every day and it tells you the meaning. There's also an app called Labyrinthos, I think it's how you pronounce it. It's an app where you can learn tarot. I believe you can also learn astrology on there, and I think that you can pull daily cards on that app as well. I will say that for looking at meanings for the cards, after you try and figure out the meaning yourself, Biddy Tarot is really good about being pretty thorough about the meanings, and they also reference the imagery on the original Rider-Waite deck cards and how those tie into each other, the imagery and the meanings of the cards. So just start pulling cards daily, learn through practice, pull for some friends, make it fun, make it light. It's not serious. And I will say also, once you get this down, all of these elements, and you start reading tarot, you can start reading reversals. So that's when a card comes up upside down, which is like all the cards in the deck, each one has a different meaning, and then each one has a reversed meaning as well. So I sometimes read reversals, sometimes don't. It's a personal preference whether you do or you don't. But sometimes I'll read reversals. A lot of times it's kind of implied that a reversal card is kind of sort of the opposite of the upright card. I often like to think of it as the energy of the card is hindered to some extent, or maybe if it's generally considered like a negative type card and it comes up in the reverse, I would see that as like a weight is lifted or there's like a relief to a previous personal struggle that one was having because it came up in reverse. So that struggle is being reversed, however you want to put it. But I hope that this short little video gave you a little bit of information, a little bit handy little guide to starting your tarot journey. It's really been fun reading tarot for the last 5 years, always continuing to learn and review a lot of the cards, and it really helps you get in tune with your intuition. So I thought that this would be a special little episode to start off my new rebranded podcast, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a comment below or wherever the comments are on whatever mode you're watching or listening to this from. Make sure to like, subscribe, and I'll be back with more tidbits and tips for your intuition, your creative expression, and your inner child healing work. Thanks. Bye.